So let's get down to the book, Taliesin Origins. I suppose we should start with the basics. Who's Taliesin for people who aren't so sure? Is he a character from mythology or something else? Is he a real person, or is it like King Arthur where we don't really know?
I think that the general consensus is that he was definitely a real person, a historical figure, alive in the 6th century when Britain was a very different place. There was no Wales, Scotland, or England. There were these sort of warring tribal kingdoms with this sort of patchwork of shifting boundaries. And he was probably the first among a new generation of consciously identifying Welsh bards, let's say. Brythonic, which is the earlier Celtic language, had just evolved into early Welsh around the 5th century. And so you have what could be what some people assume was like a new vitality in the Welsh bardic tradition. And he's one of these earlier voices. From our perspective today, he's like the founding father of the Welsh bardic tradition. University students will still study his historical work. We've supposedly got about 12 of his poems that remain in manuscript. He's a bit like our Shakespeare, even though we don't have that much of his work. But he also becomes a legendary figure. And as a legendary bard, he accrues these very interesting mythological themes and these mythological ideas, which were far older, almost certainly, than the 6th century. It's just that he becomes this this node on the network of myth. He comes to embody some of these very ancient ideas that I would argue, and I argue in the book, have their roots in the Celtic Iron Age, so much older than Taliesin, the historical person himself.
Hmm. A question I know a lot of my listeners will be wondering is whether Taliesin was pagan or Christian. I understand that isn't a simple question. It seems to me that a lot of early Celtic texts, both Welsh and Irish, it feels like the bards and the storytellers are in process of trying to make room for Christianity, like within the existing system, or that's how I describe it. Sometimes they almost seem to compartmentalize it, and other times they're wrestling with how to integrate it. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the maybe the more conservative description would be to say he was a Christian, but he had to juggle with pagan balls. That's not very conservative, is it? There's definitely a sense in the myth, at least. It's not so obvious to spot these things in the historical poetry because there isn't much of it. And it's all sort of heroic sort of praise poetry, praising the king. But in the legendary poetry that was written roughly 900, 800 years ago, or that's the poetry that's preserved for us at least, from the Book of Taliesin, we find this strange hybrid of Christian and pagan concepts. And, you know, there has been a tendency for a long time now in Celtic scholarship to kind of ignore the more pagan elements. And even to this day, you know, editors of Taliesin's poetry and, you know, people who teach at universities will very rarely acknowledge this pagan underbelly, if you like. But for me, it's one of the most fascinating things about the Book of Taliesin. I don't know how you could read the Book of Taliesin without acknowledging the really strong pagan flavor that many of these poems have, even if Taliesin was technically a Christian back in the 6th century, and even if the court bards who promoted his legend and composed these legendary poems were Christians themselves, their Christianity appears to have been able to incorporate, you know, elements of paganism quite easily. There doesn't appear to have been much of a conflict. I argue in the book that they are a type of priest class. I'm guessing, even though there's not much evidence for it, that they would have been seen as semi-heretical by the formal church because they have their own connection to the Christian God, yeah, their own divine power, the Awen. They do their own blessings. You know, they're important members of the king's court. there are hints of tension between the formal church and the bardic orders, but because there isn't much to go on, it's a story that's very rarely told, I suppose.
Do you feel like neo-pagans tend to overestimate the extent to which, like, the scribes in Ireland and Wales might have manipulated native material to erase paganism? I mean, were these early texts in Ireland and Wales, were they just Christian propaganda exercises?
So there are a few obvious examples of Christian propagandizing, for sure. But my sense is that a good majority of it wasn't treated in that way. The Christians of the time were able to acknowledge a non-Christian part of their culture. Clearly, they had to manage it, and there was an obvious negotiation that went on. But I don't think that they obscured the paganism so much that we can't touch it ourselves today, that we can't draw on it ourselves today. I think it's clearly there. And we have to allow for the evolution of culture. You know, I don't think it's a pristine paganism from the Celtic Iron Age, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it is the paganism that had evolved alongside Christianity for a good few hundred years, and it's there. We have these categories of Christian and pagan, and in the past there would have been categories of Christian and pagan, but culture was a very different affair back in the day. You know, early Christianity almost certainly adopted pagan elements. It was part of the course. They did it all over the place.
Mhm.
I think we have to be a lot more elastic with our definitions, basically. It's never as black and white as people make it out to be on either side of the divide, Christian or pagan.
The scribes, who were certainly Christian, or at least operating in a Christian monastic setting, what they actually believed in their heads, who knows, but they were still Irish or they were still Welsh. They'd still grown up with these stories. They didn't, just because, you know, they went into the monastery doesn't mean they stopped being part of their own culture. I think people overlook that. They imagine that there was some kind of big culture war going on.
Precisely, yeah. And, you know, particularly in Ireland, it was a long process. It looks like it was a long process, the shift from paganism to Christianity, you know. And it was probably the same in Brythonic Britain as well, I'd imagine.
So when I was reading the book, I wondered a few times who you were writing Taliesin Origins for, who you thought most needs it, who do you want to read it?
It's a really good question. Because there's a range of potential readers. When you've been through a PhD, you're automatically attuned to your supervisor. And that's an influence that will always be there. Two of my old supervisors were certainly there, even unconsciously, checking, you know, are you sure you can say that, Gwilym? Is that really? And, you know, and a few times I got all rebellious and said, yeah, I'm going to say it anyway, whatever. But I was writing it because I enjoyed writing it, and I wanted a general readership to enjoy the material, to enjoy the stories of the material, to have a little bit of history and a little bit of the scholarship and the, you know, the comparative work and how we find these deeper structures and how we can reduce different stories down to these simple sequences of events that are really interesting, that potentially reveal older myths. I just wanted to show people who might have heard of Taliesin and might have had a little bit of exposure to Taliesin, but never really had a reliable story of Taliesin and why Taliesin is so central today to our understanding of Celtic mythology. So being able to see Taliesin and Cerridwen in the broader culture of mythology in ancient Europe, I think was one part of the aim, and also to, you know, just entertain people. So hopefully that comes over, and hopefully it's not too dry as a book.
No, not I didn't find it dry at all. Not at all. So your first language is Welsh. You grew up speaking Welsh. You went through education in Welsh, and the Taliesin poetry, it's all in Welsh. But of course, it's the way of the world that your book is in English, your classes are in English. Does that get frustrating, or do you feel like the poetry crosses the language barrier pretty well?
Personally, I am eternally frustrated that I can't work in Welsh. I do get upset sometimes. Like I can't, hide the fact that if I could, I would just work through the medium of Welsh all the time. But unfortunately, as you pointed out, the way of the world, Welsh is a really small nation. There's not that many Welsh folks. I mean, there's a few, but it would be really difficult to get them all together to provide me with basically enough of an income to keep doing this stuff. And even though I love teaching folks and when I'm in the middle of it, I enjoy it and I like meeting new people. I love all that bit of it. But if I could have my own selfish fantasy, then I'd do it all through the medium of Welsh. Yeah. I mean, I'm even translating the book now, Taliesin Origins, into Welsh because it just doesn't feel right that I haven't. It's not that it's an obligation. I just intuitively feel like I want to, like I want it to be a book that Welsh folks can read too. I'm happy to be someone who can provide a bridge for non-Welsh speakers into this material and these myths and this tradition. That there is a long frustration that lots of Welsh people who live in the modern culture will appreciate that. Like I spent years being a Welsh language musician, gave my life to it for decades, really, and loved every minute of it, but I couldn't make a living out of it. And it's the same with these materials, is that I love it, so I'm going to do it, and I do actually love my work, and I do actually appreciate a lot of the people that I meet. But if I had a choice, yeah, it would be Welsh. My selfish choice.
Sometimes I wish you could see into the heads of some of your students and be reassured that there's a lot of levels at which we do get this poetry. Because I think it must be hard to believe it sometimes. You're a great medium for helping it make sense. Between good translations and good teachers, it is very accessible, except you miss the music often.
That really warms my heart, Chris. So thank you for saying that. That makes me happy to know that. Because especially with the Taliesin material, because it's so ambiguous and obscure. It's hard enough sometimes for Welsh speakers to really sort of get it, And so I'm so glad that people do attune to it, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, I'm aware of that. The average Welsh speaking person isn't necessarily going to make a heck of a lot of sense out of Prede Anuven or something without a teacher too. Anyway, I think at this point, to better understand what we're talking about for the listeners, it would be really great to hear you read some Taliesin poetry. So I ask you to bring some along, and I'll just let you introduce what you've chosen and say whatever you want to say.
So I don't know if I have a favorite Taliesin poem because there are so many brilliant bits. But I'm going to read the first section of a poem called Angar Kyfundawt, which was probably written sometime around the turn of the 1200s. And it's composed by a later bard in the voice of Taliesin. So this is a 12th century bard taking on the persona, and I would argue the ancestral voice of the ancient Taliesin. It's one of the first poems I studied in university that really turned me on to the idea of medieval bardic poetry as channeling in performance, let's say. And although it's still a contested idea, I'm one of the few people in Welsh scholarship to put forward the idea that it's even possible. There have been others, but they're few and far between. The general consensus is that this is not the way to understand this poetry. But for me, it's just kind of obvious that that's what this poem is talking about. I'll read the Welsh for you, and then maybe we can dip into bits of the English. But it begins, Bardd, y man y mae, neu cheint a gano. Caned pan darfo, sywedydd y nid fo. Heilon am naco ni steibi a rotho, trwy iaith Taliesin, bydydd y mellin. Cian pan darfu, lliaws y gyfoli, bu lleith, byd arddu, araith a fagddu, neu styg yn gelfydd, cyfreu ar gywydd, gwiawn a leferydd, a dwfyn dyfyd, gwnau o farw fyw, ac anghyfoeth yw. Gwneud ei peirion a ferwynt heb dan. Gwneud ei dilidau yn oes oesau. And I could go on and on. Because it's got that rhythm to it. The imaginary context of the poem is standing before the court and there's a bardic contest going on. Angar Kyfundawt means the hostile confederacy. So Taliesin is in opposition to a hostile confederacy of opposing bards, and he's going to wipe the floor with them because he's the best. But he begins the poem by talking effectively about how a deep one will come, a deep one will be embodied in this performance, suggesting in my mind quite strongly that they were tuning into an ancestral spirit that they then channeled effectively. Which is, you know, one of the main arguments I make in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a poem that's growing on me lately for some reason. I bought a copy of the Rowan Williams reading the Lewis and Williams translation that as an audio book. And at first I wasn't that keen on that translation. It's kind of flabby or something. I don't know, but it's growing on me when I'm hearing him reading it a lot. And so it's kind of been my constant companion lately, some of those poems. Thank you.
Oh, no worries. And it's hit or miss, that Williams-Lewis translation. Mm-hmm. I appreciate it for what it is. And there's obviously some skill gone into it, but I like your description. It's a bit flabby at times. I feel like it just feels a little bit rushed sometimes, like they could have spent a bit more time on it, you know.
So what is it that you most want people to know about Taliesin? I know you're kind of, you keep alluding to it kind of, but what really made you write about him?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's not just Taliesin, it's also Ceridwen. It's the whole package of that first part of the tale of Taliesin with Gwair Bach and the cauldron of Awen and the animal transformations and Ceridwen. That whole sequence of events has always struck me as a very profound myth that, you know, Druidy folks will already know because they work with it on that level. And unfortunately, that's not something that happens very often in Welsh culture these days. But I also felt that it had obviously evolved in meaning as it had been adopted in sort of the Anglo-American pagan scene, as is natural. And, you know, it's not that their interpretations are any better or any worse than anybody else's, but I really felt like I wanted to get to the origins of that myth. And that, you know, over my long years of head scratching and researching, there is a way of uncovering the foundations of the myth, like the basic mythic sequence of events that really feels like a very ancient story. All of the texts that I use to create this, to reveal this older mythic narrative that's at the heart of the tale of Taliesin, none of them are older than 1,000 years. But because they all share these similarities, we can guess that that structure goes back further than 1,000 years. How far back, we don't know, but I just get a sense that it's very old and that it's the real heart, it's the real beating heart of the myth, if you like. It is a story of initiation that evokes a figure that I would call the mother of time or the mother of memory, Ceridwen. I'm guessing that lots of people have touched on similar meanings. And even though I haven't read broadly in sort of modern Druidry and modern paganism, but I've read enough to feel like, we could go deeper. Sorry to borrow your phrase, but we could go deeper. Like we can go deeper into this, and we can reveal a coherent structure in this myth.
You really use the that story as a platform for the whole book. That's what I noticed. You keep every chapter, you kind of keep coming back to it, building up another layer. I can get quite focused on the historical Taliesin and the relationship between him and Irin of Reged and that set of poems. I really like that set of poems. So where does that fit into your own picture?
Our understanding of the legendary poems are always going to be incomplete unless we know what's going on in 6th century Britain with the historical Taliesin and Irin and all of that. And I think that the historical poetry, it's a bit more of a rarefied wine, if you like. It's it's got a much more complex taste. It's not as bold or as blatant as the legendary poetry. And it takes a bit more work to, I find, to enjoy it, although I do. It was the historic poetry of the 6th century that I first studied seriously. I'd always known of the legendary poetry, but it's the historical poetry I studied seriously all the way back when I was 18, 19, 20. But it's the legendary poetry that really brought the myth alive for me, in that this is a mythic tradition that played a significant role in Welsh culture. I find the historical poetry to be the best foundation for sure. Like, we can't go to the legendary poetry without passing through the historical poetry first. It's just stupid to try and do that, I think. You miss so much. We need to be grounded in what the ancient Welsh bardic tradition was and what it actually did, what its actual ceremonial role was, the function of praise. It's all essential to really get to grips with the legendary poetry, which then does something different. The historical poetry is the first 3 pints of Guinness, and the legendary poetry is the whiskey at the end.
Now that sounds like a good evening. So your book contains a chapter on Awen. And of course, you explain the usual things. Awen is a breath-like inspiration. It's like a wind and so on. I think these will be familiar concepts to a lot of the people listening to this. But I noticed that you also put quite a lot of emphasis on the expression of Awen, on the cry or the song of the bard as being important. Do you think there's been a bit too much emphasis on Awen as some kind of personal enlightenment, maybe in the Neo-Druid community, as opposed to something which needs to be channeled outward into the world? I mean, maybe that's an unfair criticism of Neo-Druid.
No, I absolutely agree, because maybe a useful distinction is to see it as more of a communal energy than a personal force. We have to bear in mind that for the historical Taliesin and the bards who were composing these legendary poems, poetry was an oral, active performance that happened in front of people. Inspiration wasn't necessarily the thing that helped you write the poem. It was the thing that helped you bring it to life in front of people. And that was very much a shared experience. You'll know yourself, lots of performers will appreciate the fact that there is a shared energy with a good audience. They'll feed you, they'll give you what you need to really bring the art to life, be that music or poetry or theatre or whatever. Even though it does have that personal aspect, it is 3 drops that Gwilym Morus-Baird imbibed and took into his body and changed his perception. But it only really comes alive in being shared, in the blessing of praise or the commemoration of eulogy, or in the performance of the Taliesin spirit, in the court. And it's that energy of performance that is often missing in the more modern conceptions of Awen, because we just think it means inspiration, but it's the shared inspiration of the moment of performance as much as the inspiration of creating the work itself.
Yeah, I'm always very taken with the Gwair crying in Anuvan, or Mabon crying in his prison in Caerloyw. That to me is the release, I suppose, of Awen into the world.
Yeah, and the sense I get is that these are that motif of the captive youth is really expressing the longing for the mortal realm, or the grief of separation between supernature and nature, that there is some tension, some emotional turmoil as Awen is expressed because of the differences perhaps between the land of the ancestors and the land of the living. It was one way of thinking about it, for sure. Yeah.
So a year or two back, I remember you saying that you were working on a book on the four branches of the Mabinogi. And then you decided that, this book needed to be
Yeah.
written first. So what's going on with that? Is there another book coming soon?
Yeah. I mean, I have the first very rough draft of the Mabinogi book. My original plan was I'll just write one book, and it'll be about 100,000 words, and I'll start with Taliesin, because I used to teach one course where we covered Taliesin, and then because I feel like you need to understand the Welsh bardic tradition and the Taliesin myth a little bit if you can understand the full branches of the Mabinogi. So the Taliesin material was like an introduction to the four branches for a very long time. To do the whole thing justice, I had to do it properly, and I ended up teaching a full Taliesin course because I felt like people needed that grounding, if you like, in the Taliesin material. And the Four Branches book is there. Working life, family life is just the way it is. Like, I don't know when I'm going to get a chance to rewrite the Four Branches book and turn it into a proper finished publishable thing. So if people wanted to know what I'm banging on about in the book, then they can just sit the Mabinogi course. It's just the course written in it as a book, basically.
And can they still do that? Because now you're teaching the Irish course.
All of the courses are video courses, and the membership just gives you access to everything, basically. So yeah, the Mabinogi course is still there. It's obviously slightly restructured in the book, and there's bits of new research that will only be in the book that aren't in the course, but they will end up in the course when I get time to review the course again. I'm sure you find this too, is that my ideas and my research develops, so it's a never-ending process of trying to keep up with myself and to make sure that I'm always presenting the latest thinking I have. In the earlier versions of the Four Branches course, I was coming at it from a very specific direction, which I've ditched now. Still think it was a good and worthwhile course, but my thinking has evolved. And so because things change so much, one of the big challenges I have is to continually review the materials to make sure that they're up to date, or I'll stop making sense all of a sudden.
I certainly find that every year. I think so. Instead of teaching long courses like you do, I teach like short 4 week, 6 week on very specific topics usually. And every year I think, well, I'll just, I've recorded this course and I'll just edit it nicely and that'll be it. But I'm never happy with it. There's always something. By the time maybe I teach it again in a year, I've got some new stuff that I want to add to it, and something that I think I was really a bit wrong there. And, so it's difficult to deal with just freezing something and saying, okay, that's it. I don't know how painters do it.
I'm glad that you have the similar experience, Chris, because that just shows that this stuff is alive, and that there potentially won't be a final version or a final theory, God forbid. I think it's a good sign, basically, Chris, that we do keep returning and do keep developing.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think it at least shows that we care about it enough not to just say, oh, there it is. I did that for you 3 years ago, and just keep buying the product. I can't seem to quite bring myself to do that. Although at some stage I'm going to have to, because I'm not getting any younger. So where can people buy the book? Do you have a preference for where people buy it?
Well, I still have some, I'm looking at them now. I still have some signed copies left in the office that you can buy through the website, celticsource.online. They are on the big baddie, amazon.com and .uk.co.uk, and for Australian folks and European folks too. And there's a an ebook version and a Kindle version and a hard copy you can get through Amazon. I'm very close to releasing the audiobook as well.
Good. So I'll make sure that the link to your website's in the description of this video. And thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. I
Thank you,
really
Chris.
appreciate it. I know it's getting late there, but it's been great to sit down and talk to you.
Well, I'd like to invite you back on mine in a couple of months.
I would love to do that. Yeah.
You've got me excited about my subject again.
Good.
Talk to me about it. But I do, yeah, I should go and be dad for a bit to make sure they actually get into bed. But thank you, Chris. Nice to talk to you.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Take care, and we speak soon.